But what's interesting, to go back to Juniper Carroll, regarding the Gospel of Peter and the Proto-Evangelium of James, this is what he says. He says, whatever their origins, we have no grounds for concluding that the Apocrypha contained and transmitted an authentic apostolic tradition concerning the dogma of Mary's perpetual virginity. In each instance, such a tradition would have to be established, an impossible task with our present documentary sources. Moreover, in themselves, the apocryphal narratives scarcely measure up to the quality of sober objectivity characteristic of the transmission of a doctrine that is authentically apostolic in origin. So now keep in mind that this is Juniper Carroll, who is, the preeminent Mariologist of Roman Catholicism. He said, listen, I know that Origen appealed to them, but there's nothing in them that could even be stretched to the level of apostolicity. And therefore, we just simply can't look at that and assume that they had transmitted an apostolic doctrine. And what's more, Origen didn't believe that Mary was a virgin in partu. And Roman Catholic doctrine requires all three: prepartum, in partu, and postpartum. So do you see how, as much as people would love to find some evidence, as much as Roman Catholics would love to find evidence of this, before Nicaea, they really don't find evidence of the doctrine taking hold until the latter part of the 4th century. And what you find is an amalgamation of all these different writers who had different views on it. And or if they had a view that, say, Mary was a virgin in partu, and we're going to get to Clement of Alexandria in a second, what we'll find is that the text is compromised, and we don't really have any evidence that we aren't really sure that this is something that Clement wrote. But so you with me so far?
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm going along with you on your notes. I see that you're on number 2 now, and I know that you're pressed for time. So, folks, I'm gonna sit back today and let Tim run the show. But I'll just make this one comment. You said that they can't find any evidence to support their claims prior to the 4th century, but what it sounds like you're saying, and what we're going to continue to show, is that there's actually evidence to the contrary. So it's not just that, hey, they can't go further back than the 4th century. It's that when you do go back further than the 4th century, you find all these individuals saying the exact opposite of what they want them to say. And
yeah, that's right. And you find this consistently when we did our series on the sacrifice of the Mass, is that what we found prior to the latter part of the 4th century is that when they talked about bread and wine being offered, it was in the context of Philippians 4:18, where when we meet the needs of the fellow saints with the bread and wine that people have brought together as the tithe, or to bring to the church with such sacrifices the Lord is well pleased. That's what Paul wrote in Philippians 4:18. But you don't get the sense that they were actually turning the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, and then sacrificing Christ's body and blood to God.
Right.
Not until the latter part of the 4th century. With the Immaculate Conception, you have these people talking about the sinfulness of Mary, and the Catholic Encyclopedia just writes that off as, well, that's just stray private opinion, but it was the constant faith of the Church that Pius IX said in his infallible proclamation. And what we find is the very opposite is what we find in the early churches. They thought that Mary was sinful. And here what we're finding is that there was no sense that Mary, no apostolic sense that Mary was both a virgin in childbirth and afterward.
Right.
And in other words, there's no sense that she was an ever virgin, which is a very late development. So one piece of evidence that they would use is Clement of Alexandria. And so Clement of Alexandria, this is from Clement of Alexandria. This is from the Stromata, book 7, chapter 16. And here's what he writes. It says, but as appears, many even down to our own time regard Mary, on account of the birth of her child, as having been in the puerperal state, that is the state of childbirth that involves the pain and the travail. Although she was not, that's what he says. Although she was not, for some say that after she brought forth, she was found when examined to be a virgin. Okay, so this is Clement of Alexandria, and it's possible that he's referring to the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, this is what's interesting. Juniper Carroll again referring to this particular citation from Clement of Alexandria. It says, the problem is that the citation of Clement of Alexandria on her perpetual virginity comes from an unreliable source. He says, we cannot absolutely rely on this text since it is a 6th century translated adaptation into Latin by Cassiodorus, with the expressed intention of expurgating anything that might be offensive. In other words, this is from the 6th century. It's a translation of Clement's works, and the author explicitly states that he's expurgating anything that might be considered offensive. So we can't really know. I mean, this is a Latin adaptation 3 centuries removed from Clement of Alexandria. And so we don't even have evidence that this is really a reliable source. So again, with Roman Catholics, it's often, well, we don't know for sure who wrote this, or we don't know when it was written, or like we talked about last week when Steve Ray actually put Hesius of Jerusalem in 300, but 300 AD. And it turns out the Catholic Encyclopedia says we really don't know much about him, but he's probably from the 5th century. Well, you keep on finding this questionable data from Roman Catholics, and their goal is to get us to overlook a 300-year gap between the apostles and their teachings.
Right.
Between the apostles and Roman Catholic teachings.
Right.
And many Roman Catholics fall for this, and we've talked about this on our many different podcasts, that too many Protestants and evangelicals are willing to just grant to Roman Catholicism that 300-year assumption. Say, if it was taught in the latter part of the 4th century, then that must have been something that was continuous from the apostles. Whereas there's another option. That other option is that this is a novelty, and the early church did not agree with it.